Before sunrise, a helicopter cuts through the dark sky over New York City. Its rotors fade. The door opens. A man steps down in handcuffs, surrounded by armed federal agents. He is not running. He is not hiding. He is a sitting president. Nicolás Maduro has just arrived on American soil. The Trump administration calls this justice. A law enforcement operation, a long-delayed moment of accountability. But pause here, because this is not just about drugs, or indictments, or one man in a courtroom. If a powerful country can reach into another sovereign nation, remove its leader under cover of darkness, and call it enforcement, then the real question isn't whether the law was followed. It's who decides when the law no longer applies. And if this can happen to a head of state, what does that say about the limits of power in today's world? Stay with me. Follow. Share this. Because to understand what just happened, we first need to define what this case truly is and what it is not. Because before you decide whether this was justice or something else, you need to understand what the United States is actually claiming it did. Officially, this is not a war, not an invasion, not regime change. The Trump administration describes the operation as a law enforcement action, a continuation of a criminal case that has existed for years. Nicolás Maduro, they say, is not just a foreign leader, but a defendant, indicted in the United States on charges of narco-terrorism and large-scale drug trafficking. From that perspective, Monday morning wasn't about geopolitics. It was about handcuffs, courtrooms, and federal procedure. But here's the tension. Law enforcement normally has rules. Borders matter. Sovereignty matters. Arrests in foreign countries usually involve extradition, cooperation, permission. This operation skipped all of that. So now, two legal worlds are colliding. International law, which governs how states treat each other, and US domestic law, which governs what happens once someone is inside an American courtroom. And in the space between those two systems, this case lives. Because to understand whether this was legal, we have to step backward into history, into precedent, and into how power has been used before. This didn't begin with a helicopter in New York. It began years earlier with a slow erosion of legitimacy. In 2020, US prosecutors indicted Nicolás Maduro on drug trafficking charges, accusing him of enabling massive flows of cocaine into the United States. The case didn't unfold overnight. It sat there, unenforced, a legal document waiting for power to act on it. At the same time, Maduro's government was under growing international scrutiny. United Nations investigators accused his administration of egregious human rights violations, crimes that they said could amount to crimes against humanity. The US and several allies refused to recognize him as Venezuela's legitimate president, accusing him of rigging elections. So two narratives hardened in parallel. One framed Maduro as a head of state protected by sovereignty. The other framed him as a criminal hiding behind a title. This is where history matters, because the global system is built on a fragile bargain. Leaders are shielded from foreign force in exchange for order between states. But that bargain has been tested before, and every time it is tested, the rules bend. The Trump administration didn't invent this tension, it inherited it. And now it has pushed it into the open, because once legitimacy collapses, enforcement starts to look tempting. And that sets the stage for the first real breaking point. No declaration, no vote at the United Nations, no public warning. Instead, a covert operation inside Venezuela. Under cover of darkness, US forces removed Nicolás Maduro from his own country and put him on a plane to the United States. This is where the legal tension exploded. International law experts were blunt. Conducting a military-style operation inside another sovereign state without consent, without UN approval, was in their words completely illegal under international law. The UN Charter is clear. States cannot use force against other states, except in narrow circumstances, self-defense after an armed attack, or explicit approval from the Security Council. Neither applied here. Drug trafficking, experts say, is a law enforcement issue, not an imminent armed threat, not a justification for crossing borders with force. But the Trump administration rejected that framing. Officials described the operation not as war, but as enforcement, a mission tied to an existing criminal case, necessary, targeted, professional. If you're trying to make sense of this moment, pause and share this, because this is where the story stops being about Maduro and starts being about the rules themselves. Because once force is rebranded as law enforcement, the definition of legality begins to shift. And beneath that shift lies something deeper, something far less visible. What's happening beneath the surface is not chaos. It's a mechanism, a legal sleight of hand. The Trump administration's argument hinges on a single move: redefining force as enforcement. By framing the seizure of Maduro as a continuation of a criminal prosecution, officials bypass the language of war entirely. No invasion, no conflict, just the execution of an arrest tied to an indictment that already existed. And once Maduro was on US soil, something critical changed. US federal courts gained jurisdiction instantly, regardless of how he arrived. There is a long-standing principle in American law that matters here. Courts have repeatedly held that a defendant can still be tried even if they were forcibly brought into the country, kidnapped, abducted, removed without consent. The act may be controversial, even unlawful internationally, but domestically, the case survives. This is the gray zone, where international law condemns the action, but US courts keep the trial alive, where sovereignty clashes with precedent, and precedent often wins. It's not that the system doesn't see the problem. It's that the system is built to look the other way once the defendant is standing in the courtroom. And that design has consequences, because if legality depends on location, not conduct, then the most important moment is no longer the arrest. It's the arrival, and that sets up the next surge of tension. The tension surged again the moment lawyers entered the room. Maduro pleaded not guilty, and immediately his defense made its move. They didn't just challenge the charges, they challenged the journey. In a Manhattan courtroom, his lawyers argued that the United States had no legal right to take him from Venezuela, that the operation violated international law, that sovereignty was ignored, that extradition was deliberately bypassed, and they're not alone. Legal scholars point out that under international norms, arrests across borders require consent, cooperation, treaties, extradition requests. None of that happened here. But here's the problem. US courts have been here before. There is extensive precedent showing that American judges rarely dismiss cases based on how a defendant was brought into the country, even if the method involved abduction, even if it violated international principles. The reasoning is cold, but consistent. The courtroom is not the place to resolve diplomatic wrongs. So the trial moves forward, which means the real battle isn't about guilt or innocence yet. It's about what matters more, how justice is delivered, or whether it arrives at all. And that question doesn't stay confined to courtrooms, because once this logic is accepted, it doesn't stop with presidents. It starts touching ordinary lives. This is where the story stops feeling abstract. Because when legal arguments are stripped down to precedent and jurisdiction, it's easy to forget who absorbs the shock. You do? If you're watching this, you live in a world shaped by rules you didn't write, borders you didn't draw, laws you trust to be stable until they aren't. When a government decides that procedure can be skipped in the name of urgency, that enforcement can replace consent, it doesn't stay at the level of presidents and helicopters. It filters down. It changes how power behaves when it thinks it's right, how far it's willing to go when it believes the cause justifies the method. You may never be indicted, never be extradited, never stand in a federal courtroom, but you live under the precedent this moment creates. And if this story makes you uneasy, you're not wrong to feel that way, because unease is often the first signal that a system is shifting. If this matters to you, share it, talk about it, stay engaged, because the people most affected by legal gray zones are usually the last ones asked. And once the ripple reaches the global stage, the consequences multiply. Once this crossed a border, it stopped being a domestic story, because the message sent by this operation wasn't delivered quietly. Other governments were watching closely. If the United States can remove a foreign leader without extradition, without UN approval, and still proceed with a trial, then the rules that govern state behavior start to feel optional, conditional, dependent on power. For countries already wary of US influence, this reinforces a long-held fear that international law is enforced selectively, that sovereignty protects some leaders, but not others, that legitimacy is decided not just by elections or treaties, but by who recognizes you. This matters in regions already under strain, where borders are fragile, where accusations of illegitimacy are common, where force, once normalized, invites imitation. And it doesn't take much imagination to see the chain reaction. If one state reframes cross-border force as law enforcement, others may follow. Each citing necessity, each redefining threat, each eroding the space where diplomacy used to live. That's how global norms weaken. Not in collapse, but in quiet exceptions. And when exceptions pile up, the system doesn't break loudly. It just stops working. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. What happens next? The future now branches into three paths. The first is stability through precedent. In this scenario, the trial moves forward. Courts focus narrowly on the charges. International outrage fades. And the message becomes clear. Once someone is inside a US courtroom, the past no longer matters. Power asserts itself. The system absorbs the shock, and the world adjusts uneasily, but quietly. The second path is containment. Here, the legal challenge doesn't stop the trial, but it leaves scars. Allies push back behind closed doors. International lawyers sharpen their arguments. The US continues to act, but more cautiously. Force is still used, but wrapped in thicker legal language. The rules bend, but they don't snap. The third path is fracture. This is the dangerous one. Other nations follow the example. Arrests across borders become normalized. Sovereignty becomes conditional. And the idea that law restrains power gives way to the reality that power defines law. None of these futures are guaranteed, but all of them are now possible. Because this case isn't just about Nicolás Maduro. It's about whether the global system still runs on shared rules or on unilateral decisions dressed as enforcement. And that brings us to the final question. What are we willing to accept once the line has already been crossed? This is the moment that lingers. Not the helicopter, not the handcuffs, not even the verdict that will one day come. The moment that matters is the precedent we just watched being set. Because Nicolás Maduro is now in a US courtroom, and under American law, that may be enough. The trial will likely move forward. The charges will be argued. The process will look familiar. But the path that led here is anything but. International law says borders matter, sovereignty matters, consent matters. And yet this happened anyway. So the real takeaway isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about a system revealing its limits. When power believes it is acting for justice, it often stops asking who gets hurt along the way. And when exceptions are justified once, they become easier to justify again. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Share it, question it, stay with this conversation. Because the next time a government decides the law can travel by helicopter, the line will be even harder to see. And the future of that line, where law ends and power begins, is something all of us will have to live with.